Hi all, so I chose what I think and hope it's a fascinating title for a fascinating topic. As you understand, we're gonna talk about um, the sunset, in a way, of those personalities, those characters that eventually made the so-called Gregorian reform possible during the 11th century and changing henceforth the face of the Western world um, through the construction of several papal prerogatives that up to that time were unknown, or at least had not been been at the center of papal policy, or even thought to that could be effectively imposed. Um, this is much more of an eventmental history than the usual. I will try to add some outer detail, not to make it too cold. And especially I would like to clarify that this is not a video relative to the ideological causes at large of the Gregorian reform. Nor just the political. It's just to this video and I will definitely make a video about that because it's a fundamental chapter in medieval history and Western history um, um, in absolute terms. And however, this is really trying to explain uh, through which kind of political maneuvers and these reformers emerged, and in which context, in which background, relatively to the city of Rome, the papal dominions, Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire at that time. And however, we have to give a bit of context also relatively to what had been the efforts to reform papacy before the actual Gregorian reform. This is an extremely important chapter, not just of the history of papacy, but it has also to do with the history of the Holy Roman Empire and the political project that the the German emperors had towards papacy since I think the very beginning of the interaction between the imperial power, so since Charles the Great to um, to this time. And without obviously going into detail of everything, let's say that by the 11th century the German emperors, but probably also since the Ottonian dynasty quite easily, it was something that had always been a name. The German emperors had wanted to basically reform papacy from a strictly ecclesiastical point of view, and especially relatively to the process of the election of the same popes. This for the for the obvious reason that a loyal pope would support the imperial policy, from the seat of Rome, that obviously was rising rapidly in power alongside the its relationship with the same empire, and the meaning that that was being um, attached to this duo, we can say, because it was like a company. We have seen how since the Renovatio Imperii of the Ottonian dynasty, Italy and Germany had been tied in their faiths, in their faith, differently from what happened with France or England or Spain or other areas, other regions of Western Europe that obeyed to the Roman Church. So the relationship between the emperors and popes was quite prestigious for both sides, and they they had hopefully to work in synergy. Hopefully, but never very much so, for many reasons that instead were internal, and that had much to do with the fact that the papacy was building, essentially trying to build a sort of lordship on its own, even before the Gregorian reform, which gave an ideological base to these prerogatives, because the Church of Rome was obviously trying to expand as a power in central Italy and maintaining the dominions that were known at the time as the Patrimonium Sancti Petri, so in Latin literally the patrimony of Saint Peter, and that as such obviously were you know were cloaked with very powerful symbolical aura of of authority, at least from a religious point of view, that however was translated into a political one. And in this situation, so in trying to build a papal power in central Italy, obviously the German emperors were the more direct threat to these project, because the German emperors probably would have not cared extremely much about the rise of papacy as a prestigious force, but the problem at that point is that it was developing something very autonomous and something that wanted to claim actually earthly power over lands that belonged to the empire. So the dichotomy of a secular power embodied by the German emperors and the one of a purely, at least, spiritual power um, from by the popes, was being challenged by the fact that the popes were trying to expand as secular rulers, and as well the emperors were having increasing ambitions even to regulate that spiritual power in political terms by choosing, in fact, the best candidate to become pope. And naturally you can imagine also the huge political power that even the same spiritual power of the pope had, because obviously a pope criticizing an imperial policy for some reason, because obviously the Roman Church was everywhere at that point, so you can argue that there was a German church in Germany, but even that German clergy had maybe interests to gain prerogatives, especially relatively to the German royal power, and in that sense the Pope could help them. There was a lot of mobility as well of clergymen, bishops, of people with that were also not just very educated, but also very charismatic from a political point of view, and that could really move politics within the whole spectrum of the imperial world, meaning the Holy Roman Empire. And we start from the death in 1056 of the Emperor Henry III of the Salian dynasty, that was the ruling German dynasty of that time, that had been a quite active emperor in settling affairs in Italy. The great problems of these monarchs was that they already had a lot of trouble at home in Germany, but they still retained control of Italy and attached to it a great importance for many reasons, so that they would feel to come back south of the Alps, trying to keep things in good order. And one of these things was definitely having a faithful and loyal pope. And the main problem with popes in last centuries had been essentially the fact that that Peter's seat had been often occupied by people who were put there not by the emperors, but as a matter of fact by local aristocracy or to other influential figures that could emerge, often in the same Italy or even outside of it, considering southern France, for instance. And and the German kings and emperors were essentially trying to stress the fact that the papal election had to be free of these external influences. That just the emperor, as a universal embodying a universal power like the one of the Pope, could deal with these affairs, and therefore being entrusted by God to to undertake these decisions, which you can criticize that in many ways, but it was undoubtedly safe to say, because at least even if the emperor wasn't you know was not meant, maybe, and that had not been decided yet. That's why the Gregorian reform happened, by the way. Was not meant to tell the Pope what to do. At least he could claim as a reckoned universal power, and the highest secular power on earth, theoretically. He could say to other secular powers not to interfere in ecclesiastical policy, which was at least very, very fair to say. And relatively to these, to the stressing of these imperial prerogative towards the Church of Rome, the German emperors were also stressing at large the idea of of a purification of the Roman Church. So a purification that implied obviously always these the end of the external political influence on papacy, but also a broader idea of moral reform of the church that obviously already at that time was developing as a very mundane power, very much involved with local politics as well, not just by external influence, but also for internal, internal interests. That was, definitely at the order of the day at that time. But this was probably the seed from which, and this is being stressed by recent historiography, it was the seed of this idea of reform in the air. It's not that the Gregorian reform started from out of the blue, from these figures like Hildebrand of Soana or other popes that preceded and especially followed him, but rather by the same German emperors. So it was eventually the same German emperors that gave that push that would strengthen so much the papacy against them in the following centuries. And it was, as I was saying, at large, a rightful project. It was something positive because the church was supposed to behave like the church, and the empire was supposed to behave like the empire. But the weakness of public power in Western Europe since the fall of the Western Roman Empire had been obviously the cause for which papacy had expanded in an anomalous way. That local rulers would be weak, and therefore they had difficulties to cope with this situation, and therefore there were interferences and ambiguities that had developed on the track uh, of this very very unstable situation in many ways. Henry III died, as we were saying, at the mid of the 11th century. He would be the father of the future Henry IV, who so much struggled with the Reformed papacy. He's the guy who was famous for this humiliation at the castle of Canossa in northern Italy, where the Pope Gregory VII was basically accepted his penitence in front of him after all the struggles that he he had carried out in order to fight a papacy that was claiming um, unheard prerogatives over even the same imperial power. But that's a chapter that in fact will occur in the following generation. In this generation, the problem was that there was once again a weak imperial power. As we were saying, the German kings were often beyond the Alps. Some wouldn't even come to Rome to be crowned because they had the troubles they had at home were so great that they were prevented to do so. And when there is a minor king, like in this case, like Henry IV was at the time, it was a good moment for everyone basically to everyone else to seek the perpetration of their own policies in their own favor, both from the papal side and from the side of the princes of the empire. And one of the things that, however, had been achieved at that point that lived on and therefore outlived Henry III was that reforming party that the German monarchs had pushed so much for in the previous years. So this party that had the idea of purification, purifying the church at least from that local Roman aristocracy that had tried to rule over the papal election, kept being present in Rome as a strong party. And even at the death of the emperor, this reforming party was capable of avoiding that the papacy could come back in the hands of that local aristocracy, and this was achieved, however, at some cost, in the sense that they had to find an external help. The emperor had died, so the reformers in Rome asked for the help of the most powerful and also the closest to Rome among those dynasts that were ruling in the Italic kingdom. You have to think that Italy at this point was formerly a kingdom, and it would remain essentially within the Holy Roman Empire as such. And there were a lot of very powerful local families that obviously were always pretty busy in this political game between papal policy and imperial policy, and they knew very quickly and very cleverly how to exploit all the sudden changes. And at that time, the most powerful of these lords was Godfrey the Bearded, who was Duke of Lorraine. So he was a French, essentially. He had a lordship between the Ardennes, and was a quite influential figure also within the Holy Roman Empire, because Lorraine at that time was still part of it. And he had actually he had a very movimented life. He struggled a lot against local rivals, nobles, even the same emperors, even the same pope. He was excommunicated at a certain point. He, however, managed to marry the widow of the Marquis or Marquion, better, of Tuscany. Mm. He married, in fact, Beatrice of Canossa, who in fact was widow of the former ruler of Tuscany. And this was a very important marriage because it basically allowed Godfrey to become Marquion of Tuscany and to begin a very strong policy in central Italy in order to recover the strength of these marquional power that had been on the rise in the previous generation, and that now, however, had fallen into crisis. And this couple, because also Beatrice was quite involved into political affairs, she had contacts with the popes, etc. were able to elect the brother of Godfrey as pope, with the name of Stephen the Ninth. And these and these figures were quite to reforming party, if anything, because they here the Godfrey's brother that eventually became pope had long stayed within the reforming Roman party, especially since the time of the Pope Leo the Ninth. And therefore were, clearly from the side of those who wanted to maintain the papal power, very far from the influences of external and of local powers. This was quite important indeed, because in a moment of political instability, at least this continuity was maintained, and even if the imperial power was weak, the Marquis of Tuscany could definitely at least watch on Rome, also because Tuscany is very close to that, and even the geographical problems and dimensions here have to be considered. And obviously Godfrey and Beatrice were quite of an ambitious couple. They got this opportunity to revive the Canossa's dynasty power. It's not a very well documented time in history, but in the 60s of the 11th century we start having a pretty good documentation of Godfrey's rule as a Marquion. There were a lot of diploms that show that he was trying to he was quite active in local Tuscan politics. However, there was a backside of this, because as we were saying, the same popes had never liked very strong political entities controlling them, and especially Godfrey's power was seemingly going to expand more than it was accepted, and it was, however, also time in which within the same reformers party in Rome, new figures were in fact rising, and together with them a very different, very zealous, were not fanatic ideas that would be at the base of the reform at the end of the century. And in Stephen the Ninth, Stephen the Ninth, as a pope, ruled for a very short time. He was elected like in 1057 and died in 58. So it wasn't much of a long pontificate. but it was during this very moment, this very pontificate, that Peter Damian, one of the most important figures in Western Christianity during the Middle Ages, that obviously we recall um, as he was a Benedictine monk, originally speaking, and he became a cardinal of the in the circle of Pope Leo the Ninth. So even before, telling the truth, the Stephen the Ninth pontificate. He's a very important figure in Roman Church, because he wasn't much of a clergyman. He was much more of a monk in many ways. He was an eremite. He was an eremite. He was a very severe person. He had a very Spartan lifestyle. He was a true believer in faith, and very few in every other form of intellectualism regarding the church. He probably supported some form of philosophy in order to in turn support theology, but he really brought in this very stern, very harsh behavior of sacrifice, of sufferance, that had to be at the base of the reforming papacy, and especially looking at the role of the Roman Church as the center of universal church, and not just of the church but of the whole world in a way. We haven't time to talk in depth about him, but he was an outstanding figure. He's also recalled by Dante in his Divine Comedy. He eventually would become doctor of the church, but we're talking about in the 19th century. And however, for saying that he he began to have in this Roman reforming party a great influence, and setting in a bit the base of an environment that would attract other people who were believing in his own dream, in a way, which wasn't the one of having a papacy directly in submitted to the emperor, but if anything, the exact contrary. I mean, a papacy would dictate it, as Gregory VII would do. The prerogatives of the same Roman Church over basically the whole political landscape of Christianity, which obviously brought to the war of investitures and all those things that we were talking about regarding Henry IV. And he became bishop cardinal of the suburbicarian seat of Ostia near Rome, the port of Rome, during the same pontificate of Stephen the Ninth. This was a very prestigious title for Peter Damian. Because and that obviously witnesses his influence within the Roman Church at the time, because the suburbicarian seats were essentially the the dioceses around Rome that were traditionally the ones from whose bishops would, as a matter of fact, had the right to elect the Pope. This is something that would become formalized afterwards, but that shortly after, telling the truth, and we will be seeing here that, and that, however, had always played a very very important role, not just in papal elections, but even within the same political events, same political life of Rome, that obviously was intertwined with papal policy. Ostia being probably even the most important of these seats, being the port of Rome, being a very important center since the ancient times. And at the same time, and here we arrive to Gregory the Seventh, although not when he was Pope, but when he was still a monk. It's interesting how these reformers rose largely from not from the aristocracy that they were criticizing as, part of the reason why the church was corrupted, but they were monks, were figures coming from monastic experiences, hermetic experiences, and that had a very peculiar um, mindset. They were Italians, by the way, so they felt closely, they knew obviously how they were. We noticed that how aware political mechanism in the Roman Church actually worked. So they knew how to make things work there. They weren't just the popes sent from Germany or from France by that emperor and placed in a completely different environment. They were Italians who had seen and who knew very well how papal politics worked and probably had their own idea of how to make it work, and a heck of an idea, telling the truth, since they changed the face of the Roman Church basically forever. And we're talking obviously about Hildebrand of Soana. He came from Tuscany. So, by the way, he was also involved into political events that took place as a protest against the rule of Godfrey of Lorraine as a Marquis of Tuscany. In Florence, there were some uprisings, and certain monks had criticized Godfrey's rule for simony, relatively to the churchmen that he had placed into in the relation political affairs, and how he had managed the church into Tuscany. At a certain point, even the German rulers would become to impose different bishops into the seats of Tuscany, or at least to favor them in order to balance a bit the power of the political power of Godfrey. But for saying that Hildebrand of Soana came from that environment, so an environment in which this contrast between political and religious affairs were becoming always more evident, and struggles always harsher. There was a lot of violence into this as well. We don't have to think them just of men politely debating about matters. There were many political, economical interests in here. It wasn't just a matter of a theoretical church reform. It was something that had consequences in the actual life of the church, and not just of the church, in fact. And during the presence of Peter Damian, also Hildebrand was becoming increasingly famous in Rome within the reforming party. By the way, Hildebrand had always had a certain influence at the time of Pope Leo the Ninth. So at the same time in which Peter Damian had become, as we've seen, Bishop Cardinal of Ostia, and always remember that these popes, like in fact Leo the Ninth, but there were other German clergymen like Clement that would become popes at that time, like Clement II, Damasus II. Then came Leo the Ninth, then Victor II. had always been chosen by the imperial power. So these were German bishops that would become eventually popes in Rome. So men like Peter Damian and Hildebrand of Soana were actually rising in this context from which they were external in a certain way, because as we've seen, they were Italians. They weren't bishops but monks, also sometimes very distant from worldly affair, at least in an hermetic meaning, and yet they had risen to power during that very moment. So they had known these German popes. They had seen what they were meant to do in Rome for the emperors, and probably were quite critical about it, and that's part of the reason why eventually the Gregorian reform was eventually was put into place. Um, and the same Pope Leo the Ninth had named Hildebrand of Soana as subdiacon, and had used him also as a papal legatus. So he had been sent as a diplomat of Rome. So you can understand how these men were skilled, were intelligent, they were aware of political business at that time. And when Stephen the Ninth, however, died, there was a very important problem, because the power of Godfrey, the burden had started to fade. In part because of the same reforming party in Rome, because we have seen how this same reforming party was being fueled by always less transigent figures that were criticizing the same political rule of Godfrey. So this caused instability, and the Roman aristocracy, so these very wealthy and powerful Roman nobles that lived in Rome, at the death of Stephen the Ninth, um, decided to take once again to rise once again in charge of the papal election, and they presented a pope that obviously was their favorite, and that had been in fact named and also approved by the bishop cardinals of the suburbicarian seats that were, as we've seen, tied to the Roman aristocracy. However, there was a fringe of bishop cardinals that hadn't recognized this candidate, and they elected in turn. Um, he wasn't really a candidate; he was presented as pope, in fact, and they instead elected in turn another pope, who was at this time the extremely influent Hildebrand, that at that time had already risen to the bishop of Florence, so always still close to the to Godfrey's and entourage. So it's very interesting to see how there was a critics to how policy was, how secular power worked, but at the same time these reformers were still being supported by it in a certain way. So they were playing a double game in a certain way. Thinking of a different church, even of a different secular power, but at the same time, needing that secular power to achieve the reform of the church that they wanted. Um, and um, and um, um, and and as I was saying, I'm sorry, it's not that Hildebrand was elected at that time. Hildebrand would become Pope as Gregory VII, but he supported strongly the Pope that had been chosen by the reforming papacy and basically by him, because he had become so powerful to be at the head of the reforming papacy. And the Pope that was elected at that point was Nicholas the Second, from that was Pope from 1059 to 1061. He was a very important figure in the history of the Church, um, and um, and he rewarded Hildebrand by appointing him as archdiakon of the Church of Rome, which was a very high office in traditionally in the papal government. This is the point in which basically um, the the importance of Hildebrand of Soana um, uh, rose arose to the stars, let's say, because he would obviously have a very important role in the history of the Church. He, as a matter of fact, would have to wait still 12 years before becoming Pope. He would be Pope from 1073 to 1085. Very tough years, by the way, and we will be talking about him in a certain measure. And Nicholas II was one of the most important popes, however, that in fact began the reform of the Church. Hildebrand in a certain sense, is recognized as the most important within the reforming popes, but much had been done already by Nicholas II and would be done by Paschal II. Hildebrand as Gregory VII was, he was mostly famous for producing the document that known as the Dictatus Papae, which in Latin means literally the Pope's dictate, and that asserted and for the first time these prerogatives that the Pope had in deciding over even the the imperial policy, and then obviously for which he struggled against Henry IV, and he's important for many other reasons. But let's say that the process of the Gregorian reform, as we call him in his name, was something achieved over a long time. As a matter of fact, in 70 years, from at least the pontificate of Nicholas II, so essentially the 60s of the 11th century up to the concordate of Worms in 1122, which is a pretty long time. And this is obvious, I would say, because it's not that you reform you make the Gregorian reform in the blink of an eye, but it's still important to recognize how these various currents rose to power, how everything was quite progressive, and by how even the single minds of these popes actually were vital in creating the Gregorian reform the way we know it. Um, we I don't think that we need pretty much talk about Nicholas II. I will talk about him in a dedicated video, because that starts becoming too long. Eventually we will need to talk about Gregory VII. I will extensively talk about them in the future. one by one. This video was just to show how, you know, things started to happen very for many different reasons, from the genius of certain individuals, from the interests of various sides. We have seen the German emperors, we have seen these minor, let's say, this high nobility embodied by Godfrey and his wife, that inherited some of the most powerful dynasties in Italy and properties in Italy at that time. We have seen the importance of Roman aristocracy in playing this game. We haven't been talking about Roman aristocracy much, but I hope it was clear, at least we'll be talking about that too. It was clear, at least, the bondage between these suburbicarian seats of Rome that had a very strong tie with the papacy. Since the early Middle Ages, they were the only ones that had the privilege of influencing the papal election, and the same popes had to be chosen traditionally within them. So even a provincial dimension of papal power in a way, because as a matter of fact, papal power didn't go much further of the region of Rome, so it wasn't even a regional scale proper of, you know, I don't know, a whole block of Italy. It was just confined in Rome and in the papal dominions around the city, which were enormous, by the way. So we don't have to minimize that, and how, you know, especially this is important, how the reforming idea was in the air and in the political praxis since long before the actual Gregorian reform took place, and it had been pushed exactly by those same German kings who would have struggled so much against the Gregorian reform, because they saw the reform of the church as a mean to get rid of a local political influences, the papal election. I'd say for today it's enough. I was glad to start addressing this topic, and we will have to come back necessarily on it sometimes, and talk extensively about it. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, or leave a like, or subscribe to my channel to receive further content. And if you have any question, please feel free to ask in the comments or via email. And I wish you a nice time, and see you the next time. Bye.